so you are intrigued or irritated by the topic of this video, or even looking for education, which I doubt, but that is the purpose of this video. Today we're talking 3D printers, specifically the two main types, resin and filament. This is a rather important issue because these two options make getting into 3D printing just a little harder. And that's not good. 3D printing is great. It gives you the opportunity to print things that you just ripped off the internet in order to make yourself feel like you have skill. And that's the perfect attitude because I need consumers to buy my models online. So of course I would encourage people to take up the hobby, but in this case, help newcomers with deciding. You should get a resin 3D printer because they are, in my opinion, better in print quality, efficiency, and cost compared to filament printers. And this video will attempt to provide you with the necessary information to persuade you onto that idea. Within this video, we'll be doing printing tests, looking at the pros and cons of both printers, and looking at outside sources. A complete plethora of 3D printing knowledge stored up in just 20 minutes, all with a random teenager. So without a moment's waste, let's get into the information. But of course, we might actually want to be with the 3D printers first. Ugh. Perfect. We're here. That intro may have been a little chaotic and confusing, so let's take a nice little breather. Behind me is an Elegoo Mars 2 Pro resin printer, and on this side we have an Ender 3 filament printer. Both of these 3D printers are fairly mainstream 3D printers, so we'll be using these two to compare resin versus FDM. But before that, let me get three things down. First off, I'm assuming that you already know the basics of how these 3D printers work, because every single video re-explains how these 3D printers work, and I am too lazy to do that. Second, I'll be dividing this video into three topics that I mentioned earlier, which were quality, efficiency, and cost. And third, I'm in my family's laundry room, and it might be a little messy, but this is basically my 3D printing room. After all, I'm not an adult or a wealthy child with money to throw at 3D printing. I had to make some compromises. But maybe, if you watch this video, I'll have proper funds. Resin printing easily has the best quality, and this is because it uses a more modern way of printing with a precise screen instead of a moving head. Because of this, you may have seen many images like this comparing the quality of resin and filament prints, with resin being far superior. But is this true? Well, let's utilize these printers to see. For this first test, I'm going to print two objects that are somewhat similar. A Lucky Block from Super Mario and a MP5 submachine gun. Both will be printed on the same layer height of 0.05 millimeters and in a similar setup. We'll basically be analyzing the details and the print quality. Now let's take a look at the results. Both printed nicely, but wait a minute, they both printed nicely, almost looking the same. How crazy is that? If we look closer, however, we can start to see the differences. For one, the resin prints have no print lines whatsoever. The Lucky Block does have this weird texture, which is interesting, but that's because I didn't clean it properly with alcohol after printing. The filament prints do have print lines, and although they are basically invisible because of the small layer height, they are still there, mostly visible through the shadows. The top of the prints are also different. The resin one is perfectly smooth, though as I said, I didn't clean it right, so there is a glob of resin that was left at the top. But look at that shine! The filament prints have a pattern on the top because the nozzle had to print the lines to make it flat. And this is how resin technology is advantageous. It doesn't have to do this to print the layer, it just has to do this, giving a smoother surface. But again, it's not that bad. Nice to know that both printers can print a cube properly, but that's a low standard. Let's move on to the guns. The filament prints have a few printing artifacts, and some of the details, especially the overhangs, are a little wonky. The resin print, however, is just perfect. I actually cleaned this one properly this time, and now you can really see the smoothness of the resin print. Even the overhangs are smooth, and the filament overhangs are pretty bad. It'll need some manual touch-ups. But if you notice, these are pretty flat objects. Let's print something more complex, with even more overhangs. This time, I'll print a gardening hoe from Minecraft and the atomic bomb that fell on Nagasaki. Before we talk about the results though, we need to diverge to another topic that is hardly seen in 3D printing: slicing. This is where you actually have to do work in 3D printing, adding supports and changing the orientation. Depending on how you slice a model, a print could succeed or fail miserably. Now let's slice these models. While the other prints had a large area to stick to the base plate, these prints don't. In the filament print, this caused me to print the hoe upside down in order to have a better area for the print to stick to the build plate. The resin print, however, doesn't have this issue. It can be printed just upright. And observe the support structure. It's much more precise than the filament print. I can move the support to wherever I see fit, even adjusting the support down to the millimeters. But for the filament slicers, they just can't. Slicers like Cura won't even slice structures this thin. Therefore, the supports on filament prints are very large and bulky. The atomic bomb is similar. The resin print can float and print fine, but the filament print must stay somewhat connected to the build plate to print well. And the results show this issue. The filament printed atomic bomb has supports that are printed poorly, and now they can't be taken off easily. The hoe printed fine, but the attachment of the supports ruined the surface, which will need a lot of touch-ups. The resin prints, however, don't have this problem. The supports do leave some residue, but it's not bad. At this point, the filament prints are holding up pretty decently. Still, however, you can see that resin printers have much better supports that are more precise, efficient, and are easier to work with. With that knowledge, let's do a test. Let's print something that needs support so much that it hardly touches the build plate at all. This time, I'll print a taco from Taco Bell and Jesus. And with this, you can see the biggest failure of filament printers. The filament prints basically failed without proper connection to the build plate. The taco has a flattened bottom due to needing to stick onto the build plate, and the details on the top have turned out, well, terrible. For Jesus, some of the parts didn't print correctly because the supports couldn't, well, support it. Additionally, there are so many artifacts onto the print, making it unusable. Compared to resin printers, filament printers are just worse at printing. They're less precise and have too much friction when moving to print these parts. And it makes sense. Most filament prints you see online are large and have a flat adhesion to the build plate, and this limits the amount of things you can print. However, resin printers don't have that limitation. You can print Jesus, a taco, hose, bombs, ultimate freedom. If the shape can exist in the third dimension, a resin printer can probably print it. To get you to understand how well resin printers print, I printed this battle droid from Star Wars. That is just incredible. Something that you cannot buy or make with your hands. To conclude, filament printers do give pretty good quality prints, but they are simply outmatched by their resin counterparts. So, print quality is better, and that's where most YouTube videos stop. But we're not done here, because quality is a pretty vague word, isn't it? Something can have various qualities. So what about material quality? It's a pretty important issue, but often overlooked. Of course, these two printers would print with different materials. So, what's the difference? Again, let's test it. Looking at these guns again, they were printed with your standard materials for their printers. PLA and Elegoo Mars Grey. Just the normal stuff. Now imagine these were keychains that you put through everyday use. Resin is very brittle. Now that might make you think resin is weak, but it's definitely not. It's like concrete and steel. Both are strong materials, but one will bend and the other will shatter. This is most concerning after printing thin details that can snap after being bumped or dropped. though FDM does have its own resistance issues, mainly the heat. Since plastic filament has to be melted relatively easily, it's prone to deforming from the heat, making the sun a natural enemy. Luckily, we don't have to print with the standard stuff because there are other materials. There are several more durable and more expensive materials that you can buy off Amazon, such as ABS filament or my favorite, non-brittle 3D resin. When I first started resin 3D printing, the brittleness was a major issue. Nothing I made would have survived a week. But with this new resin, I could make things that, well, look. With the right products, resin prints can hold up just as well as filament prints in most cases. But if you were 3D printing something that needed to be almost indestructible, like it was made out of metal, then resin 3D printing would ultimately win, because you can 3D print things and make molds out of them. If you use a mold, you can turn objects into metal or harder plastics. This only applies for smaller objects, of course. But if you were looking for large, strong, industry-level parts, 3D printing isn't really the place for that. Now, material strength is fun and all, but what about the beauty of the material? Now we're diving deep into the differences. Resin prints here have the advantage of printing with transparency, which is just the coolest. This opens up much more possibilities that cannot be replicated with paint. Filament printers can also print clear, but are worse at it. So do resin printers hold up better material quality? It really just depends on what materials you want to use. But for me, I'm leaning towards resin printers for this one. Resin printers can print in soft, hard, or clear, much more versatile for the common hobbyist, while filament printers can just print in different plastics. Just keep in mind the safety, because resin might give you cancer or some other side effects, I'm not sure. For the machine itself, resin printers are much more efficient than filament printers. Just take a look at the two in action. Filament printers are just terribly inefficient. They have so many moving parts. They need fans for cooling, metal nozzles to constantly melt plastic, and wheels to move things around. All these make filament printers prone to failure. Resin is much more simple with one moving part, making less noise and issues. If you were printing something overnight and you wanted to sleep, resin would be the go-to. But you might not even need to do that because resin prints much faster. While filament printers have to print everything individually, resin printers print layers in just one go. It means you can print 20 of these at the same amount of time as one. Meanwhile, yeah, no. Adding on to that, resin printers are just easier to print with. To print in filament printers, you may have to adjust the print speed, nozzle temperature. Oh god, look at this! These are all the settings that can be tweaked to make your print perfect. And there are tons of videos on the best settings. Guess what? Resin printers have this many settings. There's a reason why filament printers look like transformers and resin printers are just so sleek and clean. Filament printers just have way too many variables that can lead to issues with the print or even failures. And failures have to be one of the biggest issues concerning efficiency. Filament printers fail so much, it's a joke.
This is the last time you ruin my prints, Ender.
It's funny how a video on printing a huge castle gives everyone in the comment section a common fear. Resin prints hardly fail, and if they do, it's probably your fault. But resin printers do have a fatal flaw, and that's the resin. Resin used in resin printing is toxic and messy, and requires post-processing. This annoying procedure of washing the print to get rid of the resin, curing them afterwards, and while doing this, not getting any resin on you unless you want to shorten your lifespan slightly, is time consuming. This is compared to filament printers where you just do this, and you're done. Unless of course your print is full of issues and blemishes and all that trash. In this way, filament printers are much safer. Even kids can use them. I've never seen a teenager use a resin printer. I don't even know if I'm supposed to be using a resin printer. You need much more tools, knowledge, and responsibility to complete a resin print. However, once you get the procedure down, it is a little easier. Look at my post-processing procedure. It's so homeless, and I still get through it. Other people have a better setup and have machines to do the work instead, speeding up the process. Keeping this in mind, which is more efficient? I think the resin printer still wins here. Even though resin has a longer post-processing after printing, it still prints much faster than the filament printers can. And I found my resin printer to just be less finicky. Let me show you what I mean. On a video I made on printing toy soldiers, I had a ton of issues trying to get the soldiers to come out well. Sometimes the supports failed, the gun failed to print, or it just had such terrible details that it was unusable. I ended up having to print it in half to get it to come out well, and even then I had to deal with post-processing anyways to clean up the model. If I had a resin printer, it would print easily without failure, wasting less time. Another example was when I ran out of filament for my printer and I had to buy a new spool. This new spool was a different brand, and when I used it, my prints kept failing even though I changed nothing but the filament. And it was practically identical to the other one, just different brands. I spent about 2 weeks trying to make the new spool work, but it could have been anything causing the filament not to work. The nozzle temp, filament feeding speed, printing speed, ambient temperature, or possibly, this new filament was just trash. I ended up getting another spool of the old brand I used to use, and the printer worked fine again, but not after I wasted several hours and days. Meanwhile, when I bought a different resin type, I changed one setting, exposure time, and it worked perfectly. Of course, these issues may never happen to you, but because of the resin printer's simplicity, I was able to print things much more hassle-free than with filament printers. If I was told to print 10 simple cubes, I would use the resin printer, because although both printers would probably give me the same results, the resin printer is just faster and more reliable, making it much more efficient. In regards to cost, both printers cost roughly the same, with the average printers like mine costing around $250. These printers together cost almost the same as a PS4. A lot of kids have a PS4, but I don't have a PS4. Isn't that odd? I thought the ability to create almost any physical shape in the known universe would be more valuable than playing Fortnite. Often it is said that filament printers are better in regards to cost. A pound of filament costs around $20, and that's really all you need. Meanwhile, for resin, you will need gloves, alcohol or something similar for cleaning, containers, a room with ventilation, other safety materials, UV lights, and finally, the resin, which goes around for $30. So yes, resin printers are more costly to operate than filament printers, but I would still argue that resin printers are better in regards to cost. Why? That's because of value. If you think about it, 3D printers only have value due to models online. There are millions of them, and a resin printer can print every single one of them, I guarantee. But a filament printer, well, you know the deal. For me, 3D printing is such a fun hobby because of its freedom, and with filament printers, you are losing some of it. You can print what others have created, or even create your own things, and share them to endless amounts of people. If I could, I would try to 3D print it all. And that's why I believe that resin printers are better in regards to cost. Because for me, it has been one of the best purchases I have ever made. If you haven't realized, this video is extremely biased, but I don't really see a problem with that. Even with my opinions, ultimately the choice of 3D printer depends on you and your needs. I firmly believe that resin printers are better, generally, but that doesn't really mean that they're better for you. There are many uses for these printers, from miniature model making to manufacturing prototypes. It's a new tool of the future, and I implore you to get one and explore. Save up some money, beg your parents, or just use a public printer. If you really want to try it out, there's always a way. Just take me as an example. What other person has a setup as poor as this? And you know what? After making this video and doing all these tests and research, I've come to a new conclusion. Actually, it was right in front of me this whole time, or behind me. Which 3D printer is better? Resin or filament? Well, who really cares? Just get both!